Hello, everyone. I'm Asadullah Khan Wazir. I hope you all are doing great. Today, we will discuss one of the most discussed topic in the recent weeks, and that is the emergence of new world order. And recently, the two topics were mostly discussed, and that is the Tianjin summit and the China's victory parade. So, how these developments will shape the global politics. To discuss all these, I am honored to be joined by Professor Warwick Paul. Professor Warwick Paul is a leading voice in the fields of international political economy, geopolitics, and system change. He currently serves as the chairman of Smart Trade Networks and holds the position of adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. His deep insights are further enriched by his role as a senior fellow at the Taihai University in Beijing, where he focuses on policy and issues research at the intersection of modern geopolitics and international economics. Professor Paul is also a curator and alliance member for Multipolar Peace, an initiative dedicated to educating the global community on evolving geopolitical landscapes. He's also the author of China, Trust, and Digital Supply Chains, a work that speaks directly to the dynamics of trust in a rapidly changing world. Professor Warwick Paul, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Professor Warwick, read between the lines for us. What strategic message does the Tianjin Declaration send when viewed alongside the optics of the Victory Parade, especially with the presence of leaders like Xi, Putin, and Kim?
I think what these two events does is that it amplifies the unfolding patterns, if you will, and the forces that have been at work in the global political economy over the course of the last 20 years or so, and perhaps accelerating in the last 10 to 15 years. And that is that the shape of international relationships, both at an economic level and then subsequently from that at a political or institutional level, is evolving away from an environment in which the United States in particular, but the United States and Western Europe together, have formed a core or a central pivot focus around which the developing world functions really as peripheral suppliers of raw materials and cheap labour, to an environment that is a lot more multinodal in nature. So rather than a hubs and spokes model of global political economic architecture, we are now starting to see one that looks a lot more like a neural network with many nodes and a lot more multi-dimensional interactions between these nodes. And that, unsurprisingly, is now feeding well and truly into the institutional setup. So, at a political level, the dominance of the United States in particular, and together with its NATO partners in Europe, over the ways in which global institutions have worked, and when they haven't worked in the interests of the dominant powers, how they've been discarded in the name of the liberal international rules-based order. All of that is giving way, and it's giving way because economic and technological capability is no longer monopolized by a small number of countries. That is what the two events really tells us, is that the evolution that has been underway now in the world for 20 years or so has become very obvious now. So it's not a new thing, but perhaps we can think of it as a moment in an evolutionary process that causes us to adjust our focus, and hopefully for those who may not have been as aware of these changes or have not wanted to accept that these changes have been taking place, these two events are a sufficient provocation from the realm of reality to shake the 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 old prejudices away and for people to see the world as it is unfolding before us.
Okay, Professor Warwick, the declaration emphasizes on fairness, justice, and multilateralism. Even in the recent SCO summit in Tianjin, the member states also decided to establish different institutions. So do you think is it the reflection of the institutionalization of SCO and to effort to institutionalize a multipolar world in order to, in contrast to the Western-led initiatives?
Yeah, what you see with the emergence of these sorts of institutions, such as the proposal around a new development bank for the SCO, is the establishment of a multi-layered network or a fabric of international relationships that are bilateral and multilateral in nature, often with overlapping memberships. And that creates, I think, a very robust and resilient system of interstate relationships because it has many dimensions. So if we think of the evolution of these institutions really like the way a piece of fabric comes into existence, you know, we start with single threads. And single threads that connect two points are actually quite weak and fragile. They can easily be cut. And then we weave more threads together, and the threads become thicker and stronger. And then we start to overlay the different threads together, ultimately to form a fabric. So a fabric made up of many fine threads is actually incredibly strong. And these sorts of multipolar institutions, I think, can be thought of really as the emergence of a mesh network or a fabric of institutions that complement the United Nations at the heart, but which gives the United Nations the practical mechanisms by which its original ambitions around individual national sovereignty, fairness, and equality of nations can actually be implemented. And that, I think, is the kind of thing that we are starting to see consolidate as a result of the declarations coming out of the SCO summit in Tianjin, and of course, amplified in a very material sense by the victory parade that took place in Beijing on the 3rd of September.
So, Professor, do you think so that the SCO, especially after the Tianjin summit, is evolving into a genuine Eurasian security and governance architecture, something that could counterbalance Western-led institutions?
Well, I think it offers an alternative way of doing business to start with. So you've got to think of the SCO as an institution that hasn't been set up in the image of Western institutions, meaning that it's not set up as a block against other groups of countries. It was actually set up originally to facilitate
Yeah.
more effective coordination between countries in tackling issues of extremism and terrorism. And of course, in doing so, the relationships of coordination and collaboration on these issues has deepened, and the membership has expanded over time as the practical effects of this kind of coordination have become felt. And so more organisations or more governments want to become involved because of the successes of the SCO in helping participant members address issues of domestic instability, terrorism, and extremism. Now, on the basis of what was historically quite a narrow set of focuses, the SCO has progressively introduced broader ideas of security. So we've gone from a narrow concern around terrorism and extremism, for example, to one that takes into account
Yeah.
the fact that economic development is a pivotal component of security broadly understood. And so the SCO became a forum that facilitated greater interconnectivity through energy projects and transport projects in particular. And these, of course, create interdependencies amongst participating countries that give them a focal point. In other words, even when there are differences, there are strong common interests that compel the member states to recognize that they need to find ways of resolving differences that progress common purpose and which don't undermine the benefits that they've achieved by working together. And in that sense, it is a balancing system because it balances the tensions that can exist between states, whether it's over borders or whether it's over other issues, to balance it against the benefits that they're getting from enhanced economic connectivity, enhanced living standards for people in each state. And because of that, it creates the mechanisms by which differences are either managed, put to one side, or at least have ways of dealing with them through dialogue so that they don't spill over into conflict or into kinetic reactions domestically or amongst states. And that in and of itself, I think, is a really quite a significant transformation in the global setup because it actually sends a clear signal that interstate relationships can be undertaken in ways whereby differences can coexist with common objectives, where tensions don't undermine opportunities, and where opportunities are leveraged as ways of addressing tensions. And that's a very sophisticated and nuanced approach, both at a behavioral level but also at an institutional design level.
Okay, Professor Warwick, when you watched the speech of Xi Jinping, he said that there is a need to correct a historical narrative, particularly about World War II. What does it mean, and what can we deduce from it?
Well, as we all say, the victors get to write the story. And in large part, the story of World War II has been written by the Western Allied victors and mainly the United States. Not only was it part of the victorious side, which enabled it the privilege, if you will, of writing the narrative, the fact that English has emerged as the global lingua franca has also enabled the United States to dominate the global narrative around World War II. It's done that in part through the power of Hollywood and the way that Hollywood has told the stories of American heroism and America's central role to the conflicts in Europe, and also America's central role as the main actor, according to these narratives, in the conflicts in Asia and the Pacific. Unfortunately, as that narrative has become dominant, the experiences and contributions and sacrifices of many other nations and their peoples has either been pushed to one side, silenced, or even written out of the history books. We have seen many surveys, for example, that shows that in the 1950s, most people in Western Europe recognised that the Soviet Union was the one that liberated Auschwitz, for example, and played a central role to the defeat of the German Nazis. But by 2010, 2020, the proportion of people who recognised the centrality of the Soviet Union in the defeat of Nazism in Europe has diminished substantially. Similarly, in the Asia theatre or the Pacific theatre, the role of China and Chinese people in defeating Japanese aggression and fascism in this part of the world has largely been underestimated and underappreciated. The stories have revolved around key events such as Midway, the Battle of Midway, or the Japanese attacks on the American fleet that brought the Americans into the war in 1941. But very few people actually realize that Japanese aggression in Asia began in the early 1930s when the Japanese invaded North China in 1931. The Chinese had been fighting a war against Japanese aggression since 1931. And in fact, throughout the 1930s, the United States remained a significant supplier both of financial support to the Japanese as well as key materials such as oil, diesel, scrap metal, iron, steel, that was necessary for the Japanese Imperial Army to expand and to prosecute its invasion of China. So the American corporate world played a critical role in enabling Japanese aggression, just as I might add, American corporations were also significant profiteers out of Germany during the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. And unfortunately, that reality has been wiped out of the history books, and yet it was central to the outcome of the war. So when the Americans were finally brought into the war in 1941, the Chinese had been fighting the Japanese for 10 years. And in fact, somewhere in the order of three-quarters of the Japanese forces were held up in China itself, limiting the Japanese ability to sweep their way through Southeast Asia and take the territories of Southeast Asia. So the role of the Chinese in holding up the Japanese was actually central to the ultimate victory that was shared not just by the Chinese who played that role, but actually by the peoples of the entire region, whether they're people in Malaya as it was then, the Singapore, the Australians who fought, and many others. This is a shared triumph against Nazism and against fascism. And it's important that the contributions of the peoples of many countries actually be recognized and be reinserted into our global understanding of this period of human history. Because otherwise, not only is it not fair and not accurate, it also leads us to erroneous views about how best it is that we can mitigate the risks of a future war in the near future.
Thank you, Professor, for such a detailed answer. So the next question I want to ask you, almost all the members of SCO, except India, endorse the Belt and Road Initiative. Though India says that it wants to promote connectivity, it wants to contribute in a multipolar world, but on the other hand, India still considers BRI as a threat for itself. So what does that mean?
Well, this is, of course, partly the nature of a multilateral world, that not everybody has to agree on everything. What's important, of course, firstly, is that each country is in a position to make its own decisions and not be forced by others to do one thing or another. So that's the first thing. Of course, India will have to make its own decisions about what it believes is in its own national interests and also what it believes is acceptable in terms of its own domestic political environment. Now, domestic politics, as we all know, is the result of not only contemporary events, but a consequence of history and culture. And those factors will always play a role in the ways in which nation states and the governments of nation states approach issues of the day and approach the relationships that they have with other states. So India, of course, is now the world's largest population, or the country with the world's largest population. It is developing from a GDP growth point of view at arguably the fastest rate of any nation on earth at the moment. And so India does have responsibilities now as a significant economic player from the global south. India also has a history of being part of the non-aligned movement going back to the 1950s and of having its own decolonialisation struggles. And all of this calls upon India, in a sense, to discover its place as a contributor to the development of the global south, and not only in terms of its own narrowly defined perspectives of the world, but its role as a contributor to the greater development of the world at large. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that is now in front of a country like India, as to how it can step up, if you will, to take on some of the greater responsibilities that come now with being the largest country in the world.
Okay, so Professor Warwick, as you know that Pakistan has been playing a key role in different multilateral institutions. Uh, for Pakistan's national security and economy, what do you see as the biggest opportunity within the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization?
The most significant issue always in terms of national security, in my view, is to improve the economic conditions of a country and to ensure that the benefits of economic development are spread fairly and widely. So it is important that as many people and as many regions in a large country are able to improve their quality of life. The second critical thing in terms of national security, so to speak, is to develop more sovereign capabilities in terms of energy. So countries need to be able to guarantee to the greatest extent possible their energy security. Because at the end of the day, economic systems and social welfare is actually an energy problem. The ability to provide food and housing and all those other things that make for a high quality of life is actually all about the extent to which societies can harness energy and channel energy in useful ways. So energy is critical. The second thing, of course, is to ensure that as a country it has the ability to become increasingly secure in terms of food. Food is the energy for people, remember. And so we can have fuel for machines, but we have to have food for people. And developing new technologies in terms of productive crops, for example, improving the ways in which soil can be managed and enriched so that it is more productive, enhancing the efficiency of the utilization of water, are all vital to the long run security of a country like Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan, as a country, like every other country in these regions, is connected to those around it, which means that it necessarily has to find ways of interacting with its neighbours that minimise the risk of conflict, and at least where there are tensions, have mechanisms by which those tensions can be contained and not spill over. Needless to say, we know, of course, that there has been long-standing tensions
Yeah.
in the relationship between India and Pakistan. And these issues, I think, are not just bilateral issues, but increasingly need to be understood within a broader regional framework. And the security and resolution of these border issues ultimately are, of course, first and foremost, a responsibility for the parties involved,
Yeah.
but also have regional ramifications. And that means that, again, being able to take that broader perspective, right? You know, we can all be very narrow in our approach to every issue, but sometimes finding a solution to a problem that exists between two parties can be done when the parties begin to see themselves as participants in a greater whole. And I'll give you two examples. Not so long ago, Iran and Saudi Arabia had significant problems. The
Yeah.
tensions meant that they no longer had diplomatic relationships. Those have been normalized now. The relationship has been normalized. And China worked hard behind the scenes to enable the normalization of that relationship. Similarly, China spent a lot of time and effort creating the conditions by which 14 competing factions in Palestine could actually come together and form a cohesive grouping of organisations with a common focus. And so addressing tensions and addressing issues sometimes needs to, it challenges the parties to rise above the immediacy of the tensions and understand how it is that those relationships can actually be addressed with a bigger picture in mind. And having that bigger picture in mind also says there are significant opportunities for national welfare improvements, provided that countries can find ways to manage their immediate tensions.
Professor, do you think so? Platforms like SCO can reduce or resolve the differences between different countries. For instance, the issue between India and Pakistan.
I don't know whether they can resolve them because, in the end, of course, the two parties need to find the answers themselves. But at the same time, institutions like the SCO create a lot of mechanisms by which parties that might have tensions on other issues are able to work with each other on specific things. And those sorts of activities can lay the foundations for the hard work of building that scaffold of trust. Because without that, it's very hard to tackle the big challenges. So you can start with many small things where
Yeah.
you can demonstrate to others a capacity to act in good faith, where you can be a dependable neighbour, and from that, over time, enhance the ways in which dialogue can work and achieve incremental step by step improvements towards solving the big problems. China itself has challenges with India,
Yeah.
particularly in relation to the border issues. And we know that that has also flared into a kinetic response, not so, a few years ago with
Yeah.
bloodshed.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right? So we know that tensions can spill over. So there's no secret formula to mitigating against that permanently. But the issue around tensions is to have an attitude towards them that recognizes that effort must be made to address them, and that means being open to dialogue with those that you are having disputes with.
Yeah.
And provided that that can take place, and the SCO is a tremendous forum for those kinds of things, then there is always hope that at a minimum, the conflicts or the reasons for conflicts that exist between states can be managed through dialogue.
Professor, I want your comment on the active foreign policy of Pakistan. For instance, in the last few months, Pakistan is actively approaching different major powers. For instance, it is establishing relations with Russia. Pakistan has strategic relations with China, and even Pakistan has improved ties with Washington too. So, how do you see this active foreign policy by Pakistan?
In an increasingly multipolar world, states necessarily develop much richer and more diverse relationships with other states. So diversity is the order of the day, whether it's in your economic relationships or in other forms of relationships. And that means that states are able to, one, mitigate risks of being exposed to the whims of one other party. So being too dependent upon one party or another creates risks. Whereas diversification, that idea of that mesh network that I spoke of earlier, actually makes the relationships in which a single nation is nestled a lot more resilient. And it provides the nation states that are involved in these overlapping relationships with each other a lot more options but also in many ways a lot more safety net, because you're able to explore the benefits that come with having many partners rather than one or two. So I think that the intensification of this diversification activity from Pakistan is a necessary response to the growing multipolarity of the world.
Okay. My last question from you, Professor Warwick. Do you see, are we moving towards a multipolar world order where China is a system coordinator, or are we moving towards a world order led by Beijing?
I don't think so, for a few reasons. One is that I don't think Beijing has any intentions of being the sole pole in a new world order. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that a multipolar world, by definition, has multiple poles or multiple nodes, more to the point. The United States and Western Europe in particular, the legacy powers, will continue to be important parts of the global landscape. So they will continue to exert influence on how the world shapes up and what the institutions are and the behaviours that will become normalised between states. What I do think will happen, though, is that China, together with others in the global south, will ensure that the voices of the global south are heard more and more, and that they will seek to demonstrate through their own interactions with each other ways of relating to each other that perhaps suggests better approaches to international relationships. So I don't think we're going to see some fundamental overturning of one order, with the other, with a new order suddenly appearing in its place, but rather we are seeing an evolution of global order to one in which there will be more participants able to exercise influence and to do that through the demonstration by way of deed, so doing rather than just saying, and certainly not by way of lecturing other countries about what they should or shouldn't do, but seeking ways in which they can act as focal points to bring the disparate energies of different countries together in an effort to find consensus. Now, in that regard, I think China is going to play a vital role because China has sufficient critical mass to hold its ground when others are trying to attack alternative approaches. And we've seen this with the tariff situation, of course, where China pushed back very, very firmly when Donald Trump imposed the tariffs, to a point now where the United States has had to go back to the 1st of April position and engage China now in a more equal and fair way. So China is able to demonstrate new ways of doing business, so to speak. China will also play another role, and that is as a great enabler. So China, as an emerging major power, has consciously focused upon how it can enable others in the global south, whether it's through investment in physical infrastructure, the development of new technologies ultimately made available as open source technologies, making its market more accessible, and importantly too, increasing the research development and educational and training exchange opportunities that exist as well. So China perhaps won't play the role of a system coordinator per se, but I think it will play the role of being a focal point where these sorts of consensus and empowering energies can be harnessed, hopefully in a way that leads to a more stable and productive and sustainable order going forward rather than one of multipolar chaos.
Professor Warwick, I had such an insightful discussion with you. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. I had with me Professor Warwick Paul. We have discussed the Tianjin Declaration, the China's victory parade, and how it will impact the global politics. Thank you, everyone.